This is Jeremy with Cryo Clarity, and in this video, we're going to be going over the left ventricular pressure loop. Now, to set the foundation, here we have left ventricular volume, and left ventricular volume is measured in milliliters, whereas left ventricular pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury, mmHg. And before we really get into this, I do need to say that I have a video over the cardiac cycle, and the video going over the cardiac cycle goes in depth over each stage, stages 1 through 5. And better understanding the cardiac cycle, or making sure that you understand the cardiac cycle before coming to understand this left ventricular pressure loop, will not only help you solidify that understanding as we go through this video, but allow this to be a lot more digestible. But without further ado, let's get into it. So we're going to start here with the mitral valve being opened. Now, the mitral valve is one of two atrioventricular valves. We have a total of 4 valves, 2 sets, the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. And the mitral valve is one of 2 atrioventricular valves, whereas we have 2 semilunar valves as well. The other atrioventricular valve, other than the mitral valve, is the tricuspid valve, and the 2 semilunar valves are the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. Now, this AV here stands for aortic valve, not atrioventricular valves, because the atrioventricular valves represents a set of valves. But in this video, we're going to be talking about the left-sided heart valves, which are specifically the mitral valve and aortic valves. So with the mitral valve being open and us knowing that the mitral valve is an atrioventricular valve, we have to think of a time in which the atrioventricular valves are open. And the only time during that cardiac cycle in which the atrioventricular valves are open is during the periods of filling. And so we have 2 types of filling, passive and active. Passive filling comes before active, and passive filling is correlated with stage 4 of the cardiac cycle, whereas active filling is correlated with stage 5. So since this is a period of filling in which we can diagrammatically picture, because the left ventricular volume goes from 50 milliliters up to 120, hence the left ventricle is being filled, we know that this not only is passive filling but also active. So this is both stage 4 and 5 of the cardiac cycle, with 4 coming before 5 because passive comes before active. Now, not only that, but at the end of this, at the end of stage 5, and at the end of this period of filling, we will have an end diastolic volume. So this represents the end diastolic volume, meaning the end diastolic volume is 120 milliliters. Now, the end diastolic volume, what does that mean? The volume at the end of diastole, but what specifically at the end of diastole? The left ventricle, because this is the left ventricular pressure loop, and filling, in order to fill the left ventricle must be in diastole. It must be relaxed to receive blood. Relax, receive. But as soon as it is filled up to the max, after active filling, it will begin to contract in order to try to get to ejection, because that is the next step. Once the ventricle is filled with blood, the next step is to expel the blood or eject the blood. And in order to do that, once it reaches its maxed capacity, it must then begin contracting in order to work towards ejection. So end diastolic volume refers to the left ventricle, meaning it is the volume that the left ventricle has at the end of diastole, aka right before systole. And the end diastolic volume is 120 milliliters. Now, this is stage 4 and 5. The next stage is going to be stage 1 of the cardiac cycle. Boom. And stage 1 of the cardiac cycle is a isovolumetric stage, and we can see that on this graph because this 120 milliliter volume does not change. It stays the same. It stays the same. So this represents the iso, and I'm going to abbreviate, volumetric contraction stage. And this is the contraction stage because the ventricles have reached their max volume and are beginning to contract to work towards ejection. And so after this isovolumetric contraction stage, we will get to ejection. And ejection is stage 2 of the cardiac cycle. Ejection is stage 2 of the cardiac cycle. Now, after that isovolumetric contraction stage of stage 1, with that being the beginning of systole and the beginning of the ejection process, meaning the beginning of us working towards ejection, or that left ventricle working towards ejecting blood. Stage 2 is actual ejection itself. So ventricular systole begins with stage 1 and it continues through stage 2, but at the end of stage 2, we will get ventricular diastole. So as stage 2 transitions to stage 3, we will get ventricular diastole. And because we get ventricular diastole, right after ejection, the semilunar valves are going to close. And one of these semilunar valves is the aortic valve. So the aortic valve closes after ejection because once we have ejected the blood, there's nothing else to do. Not only is there nothing else to do, but the pressure in the left atrium will overcome the pressure of the left ventricle. Therefore, the semilunar valve between those two, the semilunar valve will close, not because the pressure of the left atrium overcomes the pressure of the left ventricle, but because the left ventricle pressure has decreased so much so because it has ejected all of that blood through the aortic valve to the aorta for systemic circulation. Let me make sure I get that straight. So the left ventricle will eject blood through the aortic valve to the aorta for systemic circulation, and as it does so, it will continuously lose pressure and cause the aortic valve, that semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, to close to ensure that blood does not backflow into the ventricles. To ensure that the blood does not backflow from the very chamber that it is coming from, to ensure that the blood flow does not backflow back into that left ventricle. So although the aortic valve opens at the end of stage 1, because we have reached the pressure threshold in which the left ventricle pressure overcomes the pressure of the aortic valve, and therefore the aortic valve opens for ejection, it will close at the end of ejection because there is no more blood and the ventricle has done its job. And because that ventricle has done its job, the blood is now out of it, and therefore to prevent backflow, the aortic valve closes. So this is stage 1, the isovolumetric contraction stage. Then we have stage 2, ejection, and once that ventricle finishes ejecting blood, it will then relax. And not only will it relax, but the volume in that left ventricle will be the same. And it will be the same because all 4 valves are closed, including not only the 2 semilunar valves, but the 2 atrioventricular valves. So here we have stage 3. And stage 3 is the iso-volumetric relaxation. I'm just going to put an R for relaxation. So it's the isovolumetric relaxation stage. The volume in the left ventricle is the same volume, isovolumetric, and it's relaxation because the ventricle is now relaxing because it has just done its job of ejection. And at the end of this, we will get end systolic volume. Well, at the end of ejection, we will get an end systolic volume. And the end systolic volume that we get is going to be 50 milliliters. So the end diastolic volume was 120 milliliters, but the end systolic volume is 50 milliliters. And what this means, because we have broken down what EDV means, we have to do the same with ESV. End systolic volume is the volume of blood in the left ventricle right after systole. So ventricular systole is what allows us to eject the blood. So right after we eject the blood, the volume in the left ventricle is our end systolic volume, and that is 50 milliliters. Now what's unique is if we take both of these values, or if we take this difference here, we get our stroke volume. And all stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, aka 120 milliliters minus 50 milliliters, and what that gives us is 70 milliliters. And 70 milliliters is the standard stroke volume value. Now, I hope this helps the left ventricular pressure loop make a little bit more sense, and I hope this not only solidifies this understanding, but has carryover to that cardiac cycle. And if it helped, make sure you leave a like, comment, follow, subscribe, whatever, and hope this helps.